Yo everybody, welcome to episode 7 of the This Week in OWL podcast. It has been quite some time. It's been a lot of weeks since we've been able to do one of those, and it feels great to finally be back, especially after the ridiculous weekend that we just ended up having. There's actually a ridiculous amount to talk about. This one's probably going to be pretty long, so sit back and relax. If you're new to the podcast, though, what I tend to do around here is recap the most recent week of the Overwatch League, along with any of the major storylines and things like roster changes, important news, big games, and more. And in today's episode, we're going to start out west, of course, where things got pretty wild. And of course, there is no better place to start than with the main headline of the week. The LA Valiant get on the board with their first win in almost 1 year by reverse sweeping the Los Angeles Gladiators. And it's very fitting that it happened this way. As a former Valiant fan myself, I could feel some nostalgia from this game. It was the first time they've played in the Overwatch 2 era in this rivalry, and it ended the exact way their first matchup went in the Overwatch 1 era. Reverse sweep fashion, where the Valiant win, and they close it out on Lijiang Tower of all maps. It's actually crazy how similar those two games were. But people were begging me to cover this game for a long time, so let's do a bit of a recap, shall we? So in the first Battle of LA in nearly 4 years, believe it or not, it did not disappoint and was quite honestly one of the best matches in the rivalry so far. And in a shocking turn of events, the Valiant took down their LA counterparts and stunned the world with one of the biggest upsets arguably in recent memory. And it came in reverse sweep fashion, no less. And right off the rip with this game, you could kind of tell the Gladiators weren't going to have it easy. The Valiant weren't backing down. They were showing a lot of resistance, actually, and between the Gladiators probably feeling a bit frustrated and trying to adjust to a new teammate as well, the Glads were kind of frustrated. Even after going up 2-0, it felt like they were fighting for every single inch, and the Valiant were right there with them. The Valiant didn't have any pressure on them as well. Very few people, believed in them in this matchup in the first place. So being on match point down 2-0 didn't really faze them. They're pretty used to that at this point during the season. There's nothing really for them to lose, while for the Gladiators, there's literally everything. So coming into Gibraltar, a map that probably should have favored the Gladiators, they played like they were desperate, while the Valiant kept it cool, calm, and collective. Their dive on paper should have been stronger, Gladiators that is, but this early into the partnership with Marvel means there is a lot of room for mistakes and miscommunication and figuring out each other's playstyles. And in a dive comp like this, where the execution has to be on point, you can't afford to let that happen. And the results speak for itself, right? I mean, they got full held on this map by the Valiant, which is absolutely insane. And because of this map loss, it basically set off a ripple effect that gave the Valiant their second win in this series. And as shown all season with these guys, when you give them a map, that is when things start to get dangerous. That's when they start to believe in themselves a bit more, and the pressure heavily goes on your side rather than theirs. So on push, I think the Valiant were maybe starting to feel themselves a little. They could tell the pressure was starting to mount up and that this was doable. So basically, they just stuck to their game plan of comfort picks with Junker Queen and Ramatra and Mei, and of course Seeker's godlike Sojourn. Usually going less traditional would get you shut down, but in a scenario like this, where your opponents aren't super comfortable, it gives you the exact advantage that you're looking for, right? In the end, the Valiant didn't just win this map, they ended up blowing out their opponents, with Marvel constantly getting walled off and focused and separated from his team, and that was that. Suddenly, right when it seemed like the Valiant were out of this, they'd won 2 straight maps in very convincing fashion, and the Glads were starting to get real nervous on that final map. Things were getting super shaky. The mistakes were piling up like crazy. I mean, they barely took control center at the start. It took a masterclass from Kevster to just barely take that round. And then even with the lead, the mistakes continued to pile up on both Gardens and Night Market to somehow fumble away this series in one of the games that you just can't afford to lose in your current state with playoff picture on the line and everything. You can't lose this one. The pressure absolutely got to the Glads along with these new adjustments, and on more than one occasion, they ended up having some very questionable decisions that definitely showed that they're failing to get in sync with Marvel as well. And they wasted some pretty critical ultimates. It goes beyond Marvel and, what they're doing around him. I think there were multiple occasions on Leesoomin where whether it was like Funny Astro whiffing a sound barrier or Yaki having a bad blizzard, there were just moments where they used these ults that they should have gotten back, that they know they should have never used to begin with. And that's kind of what led them down this path to giving the Valiant a chance. Their ultimate economy just was not good because they're wasting ultimates at such crucial times, and there are big ultimates, no less. And of course, along with that, we have to give some credit to the Valiant. Seeker, of course, for a Sojourn play, but then we have the most game-defining moment of this series on Leesoomin, final part of the map, on Night Market, one fight left, all or nothing. Liar has one of the craziest plays in Lucio clutches in not just Valiant history, but in Overwatch League history. I mean, this play sent earthquakes around the world. It was what everybody was talking about. With all odds against them, with only 3 people on point, I believe, Liar keeps his team in the game with sound barrier. Then he boops Funny Astro off the map, and then kills 2 more in just a couple of moments to completely stun the Glads and take this series home. We gotta pay homage to this amazing play. It's gonna go down in Valiant history as one of the greatest ever when it's all said and done. I mean, it's just absolutely wild. So, it seems like Glads are in a good spot, but there goes Beat from Liar, keeps his DPS nice and healthy, then boom! Knocks Funny Astro off the map, but he's not done there. He helps get the assist on Yaki, finishes that kill on Marvel, and see you later, Babel. And because of that, that was the driving force that gave the Valiant this win. And it was pretty cool. Aside from that, I think Seeker was like the main MVP in this game for sure, but Liar was the unsung hero, as he's the one who closed it out when nobody stepped up, as the unsung hero that you just wouldn't expect. He's been constantly considered one of the weaker links on this team, one of the guys you don't expect to do anything, but he ended up making the series-defining play, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. It's absolutely amazing to see, and it really encapsulates what makes both esports and this game so special, as well as this rivalry. This was such a wild and fitting end to the first Battle of LA in Overwatch 2. The scriptwriters really couldn't have drawn it up any better. And big congrats to the Valiant on their epic first win of the season. They didn't just get any win here. This was a legendary one. Everybody stepped up and they had their heroic moments, like Liar on the Lucio, Krawi for his Junker Queen, his Ramatra, and that random Doomfist frag, and then the legend himself, Seeker, who just had the usual deadlift day at the office that you'd expect, with that unbelievably disgusting Sojourn stat line of 16 final blows per 10. I mean, that is insane, and that might not be something we ever see again. This guy is in the running as best Sojourn in the league right now. He really is that much of a star on that hero, and he deserves all the success that comes with his career. Genuinely, he's keeping this Valiant team in games by himself. With how he played, him and his team deserve to get this win. The Valiant finally have their first W in almost a year, believe it or not, and I couldn't be happier for them. Even if I'm not a fan of their team anymore necessarily, it's still great to see, just because of, what that team is working with, the lack of resources and support from the org. That's what you want to see for them. It's an unexpected outcome, but you're not going to hear me complaining with how literally everything is against them. So, yeah, great stuff from the Valiant, and it was a really wholesome moment, too. I don't think I brought up the tweet or anything here on my little resource bar on my second monitor, but a couple of the Valiant players were tagging Tay Zonde after this win, saying that they did it for him, which is really, really wholesome. There were smiles all around from those guys. They were super happy. It was like a big pop-off celebration, and just really great stuff. But I don't know what's next for the Valiant now. Like, getting this kind of win was surprising, and it goes to show that maybe some other ones could be on the horizon. I mean, it just takes the first step to really get you going, right? And Gladiators are a lot tougher than some of these other opponents that are on the horizon, like Vegas and London, for example. Both of these guys are just around the corner, which means that this could only be the beginning of the Valiant's mini resurgence. It's not going to mean they make the play-ins or anything, but they can at least be an exciting and competitive team as the rest of the season unfolds. And for Valiant fans, maybe some fun times are ahead of you, but how good they actually are is definitely up in the air, for the simple reason that the Gladiators did not play very good. Nowhere near full strength, and if we're being honest, they choked this game. They had this one locked up. This was against an opponent they never should have had trouble with to begin with, and they totally let the pressure get to them alongside the other struggles. I mean, there's just no universe where they should ever lose this game. It's a really bad look, and it shows they have some serious work to do still. A team of this level should beat the Valiant in their sleep. I'm sorry, it's just the truth. And now it begs some serious questions on the side of the boys in purple. For starters, are they in big trouble here at the halfway point of the season? This is a devastating loss, and you went 0-2 this week, and that kind of takes you down a peg or two, at least for now. So, I don't really know. A loss like this can really hurt your confidence. It could only be temporary, but this could be pretty devastating and can sometimes set you down a very bad downward trend. But in my opinion, I think it's just too early to jump to any sort of conclusions. It's worth maybe having concerns, but jumping to conclusions this fast after one single week just doesn't make any sense. Yeah, the Glads lost, and they deserve some slack for that. They didn't play well, but it's only 2 games. 2 games of many. 2 games don't define your season, especially when you have so many amazing players with great reputations. I've seen people going out there and saying the Glads are completely boomed, they suck, they already regret dropping Dante, Marvel is washed, and I just find it ridiculous. You gotta give things like this some time, you feel me? If Glads continue to suck for a while and there's no improvement, then yeah, maybe it's fair to make that assessment. But after just 1 week and 2 games, no, I think we need to sit back and relax a little first and not be so quick to hate. I know a lot of people absolutely love Dante, but we shouldn't be taking offense to the Glads dropping him and saying that Marvel's washed and that he definitely would have made a difference. I mean, they dropped the guy for a reason, right? So let's give it some time first to see what that vision actually is and why he got dropped to begin with. In hindsight, yeah, maybe they wish they had his Ramatra in this series, but I just think that's unfair. That's being a total hindsight Andy, you know? You can't put this blame purely on Marvel, saying that if they had Dante, they win the series. The rest of the team also made some horrible mistakes. We just can't ignore that. For Marvel himself, I think he definitely deserves a break as well on top of it. I mean, he's playing at 4 a.m. from Korea on high ping with teammates he's getting used to still. I think that warrants at least some kind of excuse, right? Stuff like this takes some time to feel each other out. There were a lot of overextensions in moments where Marvel was getting punished for his overaggression, or just not getting the heals that he needed. It's just a matter of adjusting to each other's playstyles and better communicating these things. Marvel is trying to adjust to the style of his team, and vice versa. You really think that it's all going to be perfect right off the bat, guys? No. It's going to take some time. I'm still very hyped about this Marvel signing. We got to see what happens first. There's no guarantee that it's going to work out or anything, but I think it's way too early to be giving up on the Glads just because of one bad weekend. Switching to a brand new tank mid-season is not easy. It never will be easy, especially when your tank can't actually be there with his teammates in person. So let's not overreact too much. Instead, let's take note of this and observe for a bit longer and then jump to a conclusion. There's genuinely a possibility that this move makes the Gladiators worse. I won't deny that. But after just 1 week, I just don't think that's very fair. Glads definitely do have some tough questions ahead of them to answer though, and they have to show some improvement, but it's definitely not the end of the world just yet. That's about all I have to say on Gladiators and Valiant, so let's move on over to the Houston Outlaws now, who had a pretty rough week, an unexpectedly bad week. You just wouldn't see something like this coming for a team that did so good in the first half of the season. So with Houston, they ended up going from a team that stood a chance against the Reign, being the only team that was at their level, to 4th place in the West in just a couple of days. So this is just like a brutal week for them. Like, to get 3-0 and 3-1 by teams that you've been better against this season, that you're proven to be better against in that 1v1, is really unfortunate. And from what I gathered, at least in like the Mayhem series, is that Florida are just a bit more in their wheelhouse, as there's some variance to the meta. They're just a more flexible team. That's always been the case this season. There's zero doubt about that. And now that different looks with like the Echo amongst other things are more viable, it just gives them more of a chance to shine based off of their players and who they have. Like Ramatra, Dive, Sigma with the snipers, they can do all of that stuff. And Houston just aren't really at that level yet. They've always been the most comfortable on Dive, and it shows with the results in their weekend's worth of games. Like, they lost in the Rush Mirror pretty easily, they lost in the Sig Mirror, and they also couldn't seem to play around Pelican's Echo play well enough, despite him being pretty good on her while they played badly. And I think that kind of extends into the Boston series as well. Houston were just all sorts of confused against Florida in particular. And in the end, they ended up folding on circuit. I mean, if you watched, you know, like their defense, not too bad. But then on attack, on their attack, they weren't that bad. But then defensively, they kind of just threw something at the wall. Instead of playing the Sig and the snipers, they decided to get cute and go for that dive, and they really ended up paying for it. It was very, very bad, and that was that. Like, it was a struggle. First few maps were close, they were doable, but then in circuit, they were just completely boomed. As for the Boston Uprising series, I think they just got totally outplayed in the dive there. You know, they didn't try to get cute as much by playing things that matched what Florida were doing. They just did their own thing, and they still ended up losing this series. Like, they just got totally outplayed with the same comp. Houston couldn't do anything. Boston could do whatever they wanted. Smurf and co were getting away with murder. They could stall point for as long as they wanted to. It was just super easy for them. And they had a clear-cut game plan, and maybe the coaching responsible for this. I don't really know what the deal was, but Houston couldn't stop it. Boston's goal in this series was to single out Violet. I'm talking full-on dives onto this guy and solo EMPs. Like, they were just purely trying to take one of the carries out of the fight, always, right away, get that guaranteed kill. And it worked like 80% of the time. Like, just kill the squishy fast and get out of there. And for whatever reason, the Outlaws could not adjust to this. They couldn't find their footing. Maybe in part to just having a really frustrating week, but they had absolutely no answer. And it also helps that Decay completely diffed Happy in the Tracer duel. It was like a complete 180 compared to how they played in the midseason madness. This guy was totally locked in. Decay absolutely popped off. This time, it was the Houston DPS that kind of felt lost in this series, while the Boston DPS could seemingly do whatever the heck they wanted to. And really, if it weren't for a C9 on Eichenwald, this too could have been a 3-0. Houston got thoroughly outplayed on all the other maps, and generally, they just felt lost the entire weekend. Houston are not doing a very good job of coping to this slight meta change. I don't know exactly what the problem is, but it's really tripping them up, and they've got to get back to the drawing board immediately. And that's despite what, them looking so good on, the same exact comp that's basically being played compared to Midseason Madness, which is really, really weird. Everything just feels off with them. Boston and Florida are clearly leveling up, and the Outlaws, meanwhile, are just making things more complicated. They're experimenting a lot, and it's all just blowing up in their faces, like with the Rush comps and with throwing Pelican on Sojourn and that Winston comp, like I said before, on Circuit. Like, it's just, none of it really made any sense, and it just didn't feel necessary. It felt like they were throwing things at the wall when they just didn't need to. Their way of coping right now is to make things overly complicated, and I don't really get it. I think that if the Outlaws want to get back into things and they don't want to let this week affect them, they just got to get back to their roots and play their dive, make it more refined like it was before, and you're good. But this does beg the question, like with the Gladiators. Are the Outlaws in trouble? Is it time to have an overreaction Monday, so to speak, and say that they're done for? I wouldn't really go that far. You know, I don't really think that's necessary. We definitely need to watch them carefully, but just like with the Gladiators, 1 week definitely does not sum up your entire season. And also, let's give some credit to Florida and Boston. They're pretty good too. Like, Houston definitely could have played better, but Florida and Boston are clearly getting better, and they're making strides with their gameplay, and, you know, they deserve to be praised for that. Good teams do have off weeks sometimes as well, ladies and gentlemen, and Houston might have fallen into that with some bad preparation this go-around. Although, unlike the Gladiators, this is a kind of dangerous territory for the Outlaws, just considering, you know, what they could be this season. The fall off, along with the meta variance, is a bit worrying. Having a bad week like this, going 0-2, puts them in a rather difficult position when you're looking towards the playoffs. Boston and Florida both leapfrog them in the standings this weekend. If the playoffs were to start today, Houston would have to fight their way through the play-ins rather than having that guaranteed top 3. And that's not ideal. Like, Houston are a good team, but that's something you don't want to be taking a chance on because you never know what might happen in a play-in tournament, you know? You don't want to leave that up to chance. And also, Houston's schedule from here on out is pretty difficult. Atlanta Reign are still on their schedule next week, guys. Like, that could mean 3 losses just this stage, bare minimum. Houston might end up having to depend on luck rather than their skill, and that means either having Boston or Florida going on a cold streak, and with how good they look right now, that's kind of scary. You do not want somebody else controlling your own destiny. It is unfortunate that Houston could not deliver, because that means they could be in some serious trouble when we're looking at this from a playoff perspective. However, it's not totally over. As scary as it is, again, I think it's just 1 week. You know, there's a lot of time to adjust, get back on the right track. This team is full of world-class talent. Like, in spite of Winston, you know, being his main hero, Fearless has shown he can be a really quick learner with other characters, like we saw with his ball back in the day. They have a flex god like Pelican. You've got a god like backline. Happy has proven to have, like, his best season as a pro so far. It's not over yet. You have a bunch of really intelligent people over there, and they're very talented, and I definitely believe they can figure it out. It's not going to be easy, and they're in a bit of a hole right now, but if they crack down and maybe get a little lucky, there's still a chance to make that top 3 and to end up finishing the summer stage on a pretty positive note as we head into the playoffs. That's about all for the Houston Outlaws side of things, though, so now what I'd like to do is move on to quite arguably the other biggest storyline of the week, and that is the San Francisco Shock. Our guys went out here after having such a really rough first half of the season, and they looked so much better. Like, I talked about it a lot in my Striker video from the other day, but I want to take a deep dive into their performance after seeing a whole week of gameplay. I mean, really, the Shock just looks so much better. They still have work to do, there's still things they can improve upon, but man, changing up that support line has done some wonders for them. Renko and Luke Mino are not only holding their own surprisingly, but they're playing pretty well, very intelligently. They're not trying to play hero ball like we saw with Finn and Vindame. They do what they can, and then they leave it up to the rest of their teammates to finish up the job. They pocket them, and they trust in them. And that's what you need to do when you have people like Proper and Junbin and Striker on your team. You need to have less aggression and less selfish support play. That's what seems to work in the system, and we're seeing how it works out firsthand with how Proper and Junbin were able to dominate. These two looked so insanely good throughout the entire weekend. There were countless clutches from both of them, and with Junbin in particular, he looked like a man reborn. And if he keeps up that kind of play with what we saw in the Winston in the ball, he just might come out of left field before it's too late to win this Rookie of the Year award. Because right now, how he's playing is ridiculously impactful. The team is playing around his ball and monkey absolutely perfectly, and him and Proper have just been a lethal dive duo. Those two can literally just solo fights right now. It's insane. Shock were absolutely relentless in both of their games, I'd argue, and they've just looked the best they have all season. It's a very small sample size, it's just 1 week, but holy moly, guys, it just looks like a completely different team. As for how Striker and Probe did, I'd say that, while they weren't amazing, they definitely had their moments. I think that Probe in particular was pretty up and down. He definitely has some improving to do. Like, his Sombra was maybe decent against Glads, but really, really bad against Washington. I mean, the fact that the Shock still won that game and were winning fights despite the consistently bad EMPs is a testament to how good the Shock could be if he starts to execute a bit better. Probe, as a rookie on ping, is expected to make errors. I think it's understandable. There's a lot of growing pains. We don't even know how a Sombra is going to be. That's a big question that has to be answered, and all of that is okay. It's better to do this against the bad teams rather than the really good ones, Well, I shouldn't call the Justice and Gladiators bad, but more like, not elite, super elite, top tier. Against the better teams, I don't know if the Shock are going to get away with this stuff. Probably not. Which is why I think that getting the stuff out of the way now is just more beneficial for your team. Get it out of the way during the early matches that don't matter as much. That way they don't cost you, later on in the series, later on in this year. And to be fair to Probe as well, he definitely did have some bright spots. Sometimes the Sombra definitely did look really good. Him, Proper, and Junbin had their moments, especially against Gladiators, but also he made the game-saving play on Busan in Final Fight territory against the Justice. Like, literally, backs down against the wall, Shocker down players on the point, Justice look like they're in control, it's going to take a Hail Mary to turn this, then Probe decides to break out the Desperation Widow and finds 2 picks amidst the chaos to not only bring the Shock back, but also help seal the deal and win this series and narrowly avoid a reverse sweep. When it mattered, this guy clutched up, which is a very promising sign, especially for a new rookie on ping. And this is something that Proper has needed since his rookie year. It's really great to see this. This is what the Shock needed to level up compared to last year. Like, whatever Krusty and the Shock were cooking in the lab, clearly it's doing them some good. The moves they made were definitely questionable. They raised some eyebrows, but they have managed to justify it at least early on based off of their skills and what we've seen. Like, in spite of being a random mixed roster with some guys that had a lot to prove, the Shock finally feel like an actual team, something they were completely lacking in the first half of this year. They have leveled up significantly, and they look primed to quite possibly save their season from pretty brutal disappointment. And that begs the question now, are the Shock back? Did they finally figure it out? Just taking a sip of water, sorry. So, honestly, in my opinion, it's too early to tell. It's a really good sign for them that they had this good start, but it was far from perfect. I think we all have to admit that. The Gladiators game, there were some mistakes, like that tie never should have happened on Eichenwald, and along with that, the Justice, they almost got reverse swept by, and they're just like a decent mid-table team. They 100% have to prove a lot more before ready to say that they're in some kind of serious title contention, Like, they're doing better, but they definitely had some trouble against these more middling teams. They're not a super elite roster just yet. With time, they could get there, but right now they're still just like the middle level. They're still a few tiers behind those super elites. And unfortunately, I don't really know if we're going to find out what they're capable of this stage, as the Shock ended up getting a relatively easy schedule up until the play-ins. We're not going to get our answer of what their potential really is, I think, until we get to play-ins and playoffs. So while it's hype for the Shock to finally get back on the right path, I think this fight is far from over, and I'm not going to make any assumptions until we actually get a closer look at them towards the end of the summer, heading into the postseason. Although, on a more positive note, this new Shock team is bringing some great vibes to the table. I mean, like, Leesoomin and Renko are just bringing so many needed smiles, both to the rest of the Shock, but also to the fan base. Like with the Valiant and their win, I think that these new rookies, well, not rookies, I mean, these new supports for the Shock are bringing a lot of positive and wholesome vibes to the entire community. I mean, their happiness was infectious throughout this entire weekend, and you could tell just how much this kind of moment meant to them to be on a better team, to compete in the Overwatch League. I mean, for Leesoomin, he's finally escaping the depression that was Vegas, and he's able to get a much better team around him. He gets to pocket Proper instead of Malthol, and he finally got to his first win at the Overwatch League level after almost a year. And then with Renko, I mean, I didn't know much about this guy, but I'm already falling in love, man. The smiling from this guy was nonstop. It was incredibly wholesome. He looked so excited to be there, you know? That's the kind of vibe it gave off. Like, even when the Shock were struggling and losing maps to Justice, he continued to have a smile on his face. His facial expression showed just how much this meant to him. You know, that this was a real dream come true for him. Just being in that moment, knowing that his hard work paid off, and that he finally gets to prove himself at this level is enough to constantly keep a smile on his face, and I think it is absolutely wonderful. And the community really liked it too. Renko brought some really positive vibes to everybody, and that's really great for a community that can sometimes be brutally toxic. So shout out to Renko for being so awesome, really. He gave off some great vibes. I think I have a bit of a clip here, as you can see, be on your right side of your screen. He's just so happy. Like, absolutely no nerves, not nervous at all, just so pumped to be winning games and playing with the Shock. Him and Leesoomin both. Like, it's great. Look at them. They're having a great time. That's really awesome stuff. This is what we want. That is what we like to see. Proper and Junbin, not so much of a reaction, but, you know, it's all good. So, that does it for the Shock. I thought they were definitely one of the more interesting moments of this weekend. So now we're going to move on to the Vegas Eternal. They also, you know, coming into this week, there's going to be a lot of eyes on them. Brand new roster, or at least partially new roster. They made some changes after making releases, plus some drama. And some might argue they showed some improvement. They showed some signs of life. It wasn't always pretty, but Vegas showed that, you know, maybe there is some potential with this group after making some needed changes. It definitely was not super consistent, but it's better than nothing. It's better than what we've seen at least most of the time from this group in the first half of the year. I mean, some of the moments in the NYXL game were definitely pretty horrendous to watch as this new team tried to feel each other out. I will totally give them that. Like, there were some ugly moments. But I think as time went on, they started to get it a little bit. They started to get a bit more comfortable. I mean, in the New York series, they nearly ended up taking Midtown. It was like a one fight. That was it. They just need to win one more fight. It was right there for them. And on top of that, we have the Boston series, right? Like, the New York game was tough, but the Boston series was extremely competitive. I was not expecting this at all from these guys. They gave Boston one hell of a scare, really. Like, with some better execution, maybe this goes to a map 5. We were in borderline reverse sweep territory with how intense this got. Ilios was super back and forth. Numbani, they at least had a solid attack at the start. Route 66, they were able to hold Boston to just 1 point. They had a solid defense. And on push, it was super back and forth. Knife was literally doing everything he could. Those new pickups were shining. Tuyu was finding some explosiveness on tank with Junker, Quaid, and Winston. But, I mean, Knife in particular, man. This dude was a god in this one. He was trading blow for blow with Decay, one of the best tracers this league has to offer. And in fact, I'd argue that he was the better player in this series. Like, Vegas had absolutely no business making this game so close, but Knife by himself at times was dragging the rest of his team, kicking and screaming. It is really rare to find a dominant tracer performance in an underdog situation like this against such a good team. It speaks volumes to what Knife's potential could be. There are a lot of people saying that he could be a beast at the Overwatch League level. I'm glad to see him delivering. And it goes to show that this guy's pretty hungry to prove himself. He's not going to go easy out there. He's not going to back down, even against a team full of superstars like this. And he deserves a lot of credit for that. A lot of the time, rookies in their early games, you know, the pressure gets to them in these situations, but not him at all. His tracer was just on point. Boom, boom, boom. Constantly finding picks, diffing Decay. It was absolutely amazing to watch. And I can only pray that flashes like this end up attracting attention from better teams later down the line, so maybe he could play on a more significant team and have these plays he make actually matter. Regardless, though, of what's to come with his future and some of these other guys, this was the kind of weekend that gives you a bit of hope if you're a Vegas fan. It makes you look forward at least a little bit to what's coming next, and it gives you hope that maybe you will win a game after all, you know, and not extend this losing streak to like a ridiculous amount that goes all the way back to the end of last season. It's great, man, it really is. Even if, you know, Vegas, their org, has some questions and maybe isn't the most likable. I'm glad the players are starting to play a bit better and the vibes are getting stronger. They were able to double their map win count by taking a map off Boston, which is wonderful. And some of these other games coming up may be a bit more manageable. So I'm pretty pumped to see where Vegas can go from here. Even with this sudden change with a mixed roster and having guys on ping, they're giving everybody hell, and you absolutely love to see it. And hopefully with a couple of more weeks, they can kind of refine their gameplay and maybe push their opponent to a map 5 at least, or get that W. It's going to be really fun to see how Knife can continue his career here and develop as a young superstar. Vegas are actually kind of fun. Like, I never thought I'd say that, but I really enjoyed watching them. Who I didn't enjoy watching, though, was the London Spitfire. I mean, like, losing to Rain is whatever, I get it, but this game against New York, man, oh lord, this was a bad one. They looked painfully out of their comfort zone. This team is a bunch of rush one tricks, and when that doesn't work out, they're just bad. They're just so terrible. What we saw against the alexyOWL might even be a new low point for them this year. I mean, just refusing to play Sombra was really strange, especially considering they were more willing to play her in the first half of this year. Like, they would rather risk Sparker on hit scan the entire time, which just isn't going to work in this kind of meta. Ashe and Cassidy can be strong at times, and the Hanzo as well, but they're not going to be able to fully keep pace on a map-to-map basis. It's just too easy of a dive target, especially when your team clearly isn't that coordinated. London seem to be needlessly putting themselves at a massive disadvantage. Like, I just don't think there's a reason to never play a Sombra the entire series. Even if you're not a Sombra team, you've got to at least try it. You showed us that with Backbone, so why not try it with Sparker, man? Why not? What do you have to lose at this point? Your season's pretty much over, so you might as well try and improve on the stuff that everybody's actually playing, you feel me? If not, then why are you even bothering doing this hybrid rush or hybrid Winston nonsense, like with a sniper? You might as well just be rush one tricks every single map if you're that afraid, you know? You just look so unorganized and uncomfortable. You're purposely putting yourself at a disadvantage, and you look so lost because of it. That time from a year ago where they looked so competitive and like this fun underdog is nowhere to be seen. Kellen and the boys had an absolute field day in this one. It was far too easy. And for Kellen in particular, he literally could do anything he wanted. At one point, he went on like a 20-player kill streak, and he was killing squishies super deep in the backline for free all series. And in the end, when the stat card came up, he died less than 2 times per 10 minutes on Winston over the entire series. How does a Winston get punished less than 2 deaths per 10 over the entire course of a game? There is never a world where that should ever be happening. London are terrible, man. They can't play dive. They can't play Sombra. Their rush comp can't work. And it's just so embarrassing. This fall from grace is extremely pathetic, and I'm pretty upset with them. And also, they don't just suck because of Hottie or another player. Let's get that out of the way too. I think this is generally on the team. There is a fundamental problem. There is a fundamental lacking of an understanding of how to make this work as a collective unit. Everybody was to blame. I think the only guy that consistently played well was Sauna. He was the only guy doing anything. He was the only guy that looked like he wanted to win on that Tracer. Everybody else, I don't know what the heck they were doing. It was terrible though. And with a loss here, with losing this game to alexyOWL, their odds of making the play-ins are now slim to none, and their season is basically over barring some kind of miracle. It's super disappointing, and we can only pray that they at least look a bit more competitive before the season comes to a close. I am very, very disappointed with how Spitfire are playing, and I just hope that some kind of change can come through, like, just so they don't look so embarrassingly bad. Because with how they're playing right now, they might even lose to like Valiant or Vegas. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's how bad they looked. We'll see how they do from here on out though. So aside from that, I think I'm done with my rant on London, and that basically concludes my thoughts on the Western games. All the other teams, you know, they're all fun to watch for one reason or another, but those were the things that seriously stood out. So now we're going to move into the East. And the first place I wanted to start is with Seoul Infernal. I apologize to any Infernal fans watching this. I was very, 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 very wrong about the Spark being the best team in the East. Clearly, that is still you guys with how you played this weekend and the absolute dominance that you put on the Hangzhou Spark. I mean, holy crap, man. I expected the Spark to be the best team in the East after doing better in Midseason Madness, after watching Infernal choke and play so badly. It seemed like Spark were on top of their game and like they're figuring it out, but Infernal showed that those guys still have a ways to go and that they're the ones who own this region. This game against the Spark might have been the biggest blowout of the season between two solid teams. We're talking 200% to 0 on control, a full hold on Circuit Royale, and a full hold on Midtown. Spark got absolutely nothing going in this series. There was no offense to be spoken of. There was zero, zilch, nada. All of their plans were thwarted constantly, and Zest was just a man on a mission, absolutely unstoppable on that Tracer. And because of this performance, Infernal are 1000% the number one team in the East. They have constantly proven it in the qualifiers, and they showed it here again. There was maybe a moment of doubt in Midseason Madness, but they've adjusted and showed why this team is pretty darn special. And honestly, I'm kind of pissed about it. I swear, like, the only time Infernal suck is when I believe in them. Every time I pick them, they just seem to lose hard. It happened with Dynasty in Week 1, it happened in Midseason Madness, but then when I doubt them, they look really, really good. Maybe I should just not pick Infernal every game for the sake of their fans, man. It really makes you wonder what the heck went wrong in, like, Midseason Madness, though, because this felt like a completely different team. You can tell that LAN really does affect them. Like, I was thinking maybe it's really not that huge of a deal when they're talking about how LAN seems to make them nervous. But with performances like this, there's a lot of truth behind it. Maybe they really just can't handle LAN yet. Maybe the lights were just a little too bright in that Dynasty game and in the Midseason Madness. Maybe they're just buffed when they play from home. Either way, I think it was a really great week for them, and at this point they're in control of their own destiny. The one thing stopping them from potential greatness is really themselves and getting over these nerves. Otherwise, I think that they're in for a really good end of the season. But if they don't figure it out, if LAN continues to be a problem, then maybe they're just going to be a good regular season team and then bad everywhere else. And then, as usual, the Philly faithful will have a disappointing season. Although, I gotta say, on the topic of Infernal being the best team in the East, there's a pretty interesting thing to point out here with both regions, really, where Reign and Infernal have, like, this obvious tier break above the rest of their respective regions. I mean, Reign, we'll see what happens as, like, Mayhem and Boston continue their stage, but after Houston flopped the way they did, and Infernal put Spark in their place, it seems like neither of them really have any competition for their top spots right now. Like, it wasn't always like that. First half of the season, there was a bit more debate, but not so much right now. And if things continue the way they are right now, this might end up being like the least decisive race that we've had in recent memory. They might win most, if not all, their games quite convincingly from here on out. It feels super weird having these one-team races, and one can only hope that something's going to change to make things a bit more interesting. Otherwise, this season's kind of going to end on like a sleeper note, I'd say. That's about it for Infernal. So next up, where I'd like to go is the Shanghai Dragons, who had a pretty interesting week. Pretty wild, I'd say. They started off looking a lot better with Fate. I mean, noticeably better in that Dynasty game. So much more comfortable, so much more organized. A Winston player that actually knows what he was doing. And they ended up getting a solid win over the Dynasty. Like, that game was a lot closer than the score implies, I'd say. Like, it was a 3-1, but every map felt like it was back and forth until push, really. But, you know, Dragons played well when they needed to. There was a definite difference in play during the clutch when it really mattered. They just felt like a normal team to me. Having that stable presence of Fate at tank gave that DPS line more opportunities to do their thing. The Dynasty win was literally the exact thing they were hoping for. It's a great start for them. It builds up the confidence. It builds up the synergy. It was awesome. And it's one less hole to expose on the Shanghai team that has largely been a disappointment so far. And with every win, they get a little closer to making that comeback a reality, just inch by inch by inch. However, based off of the total performance of this weekend, they still have a ways to go. Because for whatever reason, they can beat the Dynasty, but then lose to the Contenders team in Dreamers, who, mind you, lost 3 players recently to OWL teams. Fate kind of getting tank diffed here was pretty rough. Dreamer and Ligue had their way all series, and the Shanghai DPS could not keep up with Top Dragon and the newcomer SAD. Much like their LA counterparts, it goes to show that mid-season tank swaps definitely take some time to get used to. Fate might be very experienced and very familiar with Moon's system, but he hasn't exactly played with any of these guys before, so it's going to take time to build up that chemistry and find that consistency and play as a total unit all the time. It's a little crazy to have such an up and down week like this, but, you know, getting consistently beat by Contenders teams a couple of months ago or like 1 month ago goes to show that, you know, we gotta have a reality check. The Dragons are improving, but they were pretty bad last stage, and one player doesn't solve all of those problems overnight. They were already losing to Contenders teams to begin with, so, you know, this stuff takes time. The Dragons as a whole definitely are getting better though, which I think is great. There was some more organization, there was some good and bad, and we might see a couple of these random flops for the time being. But, you know, if they can really start to figure it out come knockouts, you know, with how Viper and Hisu are playing, and Fate maybe gets a bit more on track with the rest of his team, then all can be forgiven if they can come up big during the knockouts and potentially end up securing a playoff spot. You never know what could happen, especially when the DPS look that good. For now, all we can do is sit back and watch to see if these improvements continue to come, or if the Dragons end up not having enough left in the tank. But I just talked about Dreamers, you know, I was bringing up how Dragons lost to them, so that's probably a good segue for us here. Talking about the interesting week of Dreamers, starting off the summer stage 2-0. Like, despite losing Easyhan and Spectra and Donghoon, Dreamers still played super well. This is a well-coached team, and they have some very talented players. Like, I expected them to look noticeably weaker. It just seemed like it'd be a natural conclusion to come to. But so far, they have looked like one of the most confident teams in the East, not just amongst Contenders teams, but in general. The OG core is still holding down the fort, and I think the new guys in particular have stepped up pretty big. Top Dragon and SAD looked great. They diffed the Shanghai DPS. That is not an easy thing to do. They held their own against some well-established DPS players this weekend. It's like Dreamers never lost any of their firepower to begin with. SAD in particular, I mean, I'd never even heard of this guy, and he looked so good. Just a complete wild card, but in his debut, absolutely dominated. He looked super hungry to prove himself. Dreamers look primed to potentially make another knockout run this stage, and I genuinely do wonder if they're still the best Contenders team. They really might be with how they performed here. For now, I'd like to say that they're off to a pretty ideal start though, and I'll be watching the next couple of weeks with them with great anticipation. Moving on from Dreamers, I think we should probably get into the Guangzhou Charge, because they are still on a bit of a downward trend. It started off fine against O2, but, you know, you expect them to beat O2. But in the Spark game, you know, the real game, they showed they have a serious problem. Their blowout loss to the Spark is all the evidence needed to suggest that they didn't really make any improvements over the break. There's not much of a philosophy change. There's not much practice with the stuff that they needed to practice. Their stocks are beginning to fall drastically. As the weeks go by, this gap between them and like Infernal and Spark just increases and increases. And as of right now, they might not even be the third best team depending on Dallas. And it's all for one simple reason with them, right? The Charge cannot play Sombra. It's not that they don't try to, they just literally don't want to play her. They are terrified. I guess it's just not within Jimmy's comfort zone despite him playing her last year. So instead they'd rather just have him one-trick Hanzo basically. And while the strat can work, like I mentioned before with London, it's just not the standard. It's not something you can afford to literally play every single map all the time. Sombra Tracer Winston is the strongest DPS tank line to run in the current meta. You want that full-on dive. That's what everybody in the East is embracing right now. And if you can't keep up, you're gonna lag behind. The Charge have a serious crisis right now with their DPS that has to be solved. Jimmy is not comfortable right now. He can't play the Sombra or the Tracer, and that's costing his team. They have to find a way around this. You got to pick up another player or just risk it and put Jimmy on that Sombra. You can't just have him be a sniper specialist if you want to win the big games. And on top of that, I need to see Piggy step up on his Winston too. This just can't be on Choi and the support sometimes. The charge need to be more flexible, more explosive. They need more contributions from other players. How you're playing is good enough to keep you afloat against some of the worst teams, but it's not going to be enough to push you over the top, and that's ultimately what you're trying to do. There's only so many playoff spots up for grabs this year in the East. So really, their chances are very limited. If they want to avoid being labeled as chokers for like the millionth time in a row, they've got to stop operating at a disadvantage like this. They've got to get more flexible. No ifs, ands, or buts. The Charge need to shake off this midseason slump and get into form and catch up with their rivals. Otherwise, we're going yet another year without Choice A1 in a serious tournament. For the sake of potential riots on the streets, let's try and avoid this at all costs, shall we? Speaking of big cost, where I wanted to end my Eastern Division discussions is with the Seoul Dynasty. If I can find them. There we go. So, this week was not a very good look for them. The Shanghai loss, like I said, was close, but still, they did flop pretty hard in the clutch with a chance to start the stage off on the right foot. The way they played on push was absolutely unacceptable, excuse me. And with that loss, they are, unfortunately, without a doubt right now, the worst team of the OG6 competing in the East. The team just doesn't seem comfortable with Bell's Rhea in the game, and the support woes also are not helping them. They just lack any sort of impact on this role, you feel me? And with how important support has been this year, you're in for a world of hurt if you can't figure that out. Leesoomin, there was a lot of potential with this guy, but the way his aggression has panned out with the lack of results has really put the Dynasty in a tough spot. He's been super greedy with his positioning, but he lacks the kills to show for it. He's not helping his team win. And also with Krillin on main support at the same time, he can't be super impactful either. All that combined just has the Dynasty struggling big time, and that Dragons game was super disappointing, and even in the Panthera game to a certain extent, I was not very happy with what I saw. Like, they 3-0'd them, but it oftentimes felt like Panthera had a chance in these maps. And at least in my opinion, Panthera are like the worst contenders team this split. So it's not a very good look, even if you did 3-0 them. The Dynasty have such a long way to go still. They're still figuring out a lot of things on the fly, and they're running out of time. With how much they're lacking, with the holes they're trying to get out of right now, it just might be too late for a comeback, which is really unfortunate because this team does have some likable players. And thankfully, it seems the Dynasty at least kind of recognized that it's now or never, because earlier this morning, as of this recording, they decided to part ways with Leesoomin. His potential just did not take form on the Dynasty, and him and Krillin just weren't bringing anything of value. Clearly, you couldn't have both of them in the same lineup. It just was not worth it. And if you're in a position where you can afford to possibly shake things up and try and better your team with somebody who's maybe a bit more talented or fits your scheme better, you've got to do it, right? As for what's next if you're the Seoul Dynasty, it seems the likely outcome would be to probably sign Vindame. That's what the rumors keep saying, that they're going to release Leesoomin and get Vindame. I have no idea if that's actually going to come true or not. I suppose that makes sense, with Vindame thriving under Toby's system last year. Maybe he can immediately impact your main support position, and then you could put Krillin back on flex support, which he's a lot more comfortable on, which could better enable him. And last year, he was a little underrated in my opinion, so maybe that backline could work out at least a little bit better. The East doesn't have a lot of stacked backlines, so maybe Krillin and Vindame can hold their own, I feel like. No matter what the Dynasty's choice ends up being with these changes to their support line, attempting to improve your backline is in your best interest, and I just hope that they make the right choice. If it's for the best, if it means there's a chance to maybe at least kind of turn your season around, then you gotta go for it. At this point, they really don't have anything left to lose. They're in grave danger of not making the playoffs, so sometimes you've got to get desperate. Either way, I think this is a very tough uphill climb ahead of them, and I'll be interested to see how they handle it, because if things keep going this way, this will be their worst season in a very, very long time. Oh, and before I forget, before I forget about, this one other thing with the Dynasty, we got to bring up probably one of the craziest moments of the week when Panthera against them ended up having one of the worst C9s I have ever seen. So, for context, if you missed it, basically, Panthera has a chance to send this into extra rounds, right? All the Dynasty players are coming back from spawn. Krillin's about to make a res here to get them back faster. But they just need to win one fight, and they can send this to extra rounds and potentially, win this map and continue the series. Everything's looking okay. They got positioning on the cart. Prophet's there for the touch. But then, here's the key thing, though. Leesoomin decides to jump in on Develop, who's on Ana for some reason. Don't ask me about that. But Leesoomin is in the back line in this little area here. Slay's trying to help as well. Leesoomin pops the primal. And then all of a sudden, people start to tunnel vision. All of a sudden now, Nice is here as well. Then you have Jasmine, who's nanoed, probably trying to get on the back line. And then Becky's off doing whatever the heck he's doing. And then, boom, they C9, and that's the end. I honestly thought that Panthera capped when I first saw this, but no. What actually happened was everybody decided it's time to get off the point and play hero ball and do their own thing. Big time miscommunication issue here, and one of the worst C9s of the year, if not in many, many years. Like, yikes, man. Yikes. That's a bad one. Anyway, that basically wraps up my thoughts on the games this week. So next I'm going to bring back a segment that I actually haven't been able to do in literal episodes between, having special guests on and forgetting about it. And that is ATP's Performers of the Week. What I like to do is pick one standout player from each role that I really appreciated the efforts of and make them like a mini all-star team, so to speak. And on support, I'm going to start by going with Liar. I know it's mostly for the one play I showed earlier, which might make it a little too ridiculous, but it's like just the magnitude of that play that gives him support of the week. Between how legendary it was and how it gave the Valiant their first win, I just feel like that's so huge and that can't be ignored. This one play ended up saving the Valiant and giving them a win, and it saved them from potentially a winless season. You never know what's going to happen over these coming weeks, so for that, I think he deserves to be recognized for his heroics. That's a pretty big deal. Then on tank, I'm going to go with my guy Junbin. I thought that he was by far the most dominant player at the tank position this week. His Wrecking Ball and Winston were just so cracked. Like, he looked so in his element, so comfortable with these new supports, giving him the proper support that he needs. No pun intended there. Like, the dives were just so great with proper and probe. He was all over this stuff. Absolutely loved the way he played. And he had some insane clutches, too. His Winston clutches this entire weekend were great. Like this one, for example. Lastro pops Rally. He's able to primal him off of the map. And, like, Gladiators did end up getting the checkpoint or like more progress eventually, but this stalled them out with that primal, and he had a couple of those. There was one against the Justice too where he did the same thing. Like, it's actually crazy watching this guy fully enabled. He's an absolute beast, and he's finally realizing that potential that we all know that he has, which is amazing. And what I love the most about him is that there's still chances for him to maybe get back into that Rookie of the Year conversation. If Junbin won Rookie of the Year, I would not complain. It'd be pretty sick. As for my DPS player of the week, you might have already saw it before, I kind of spoiled it, but I'm going with my guy Zest, who managed to take home not one, but two players of the match in one weekend. He was just absolutely on fire with the Tracer. This guy's playing with a vengeance right now. Like, we're talking two unreal Tracer performances back to back. You could tell that he was really mad about the shortcomings of Mid-Season Madness, because he was just everywhere throughout both series. He really, really wanted to show out and, get back on the right foot after such a disappointing thing that happened. It was a real chip on his shoulder, arguably, I'd say, You disappointed all of your fans on LAN. You're the home team. You couldn't win a single game. You had some bad chokes. That can affect you, and I'm glad to see it's motivating him to play better, because this is some of the best Overwatch I've seen Zest play all season. He absolutely diffed Leave in this game. It was just not even a contest. And in the end, I think what really impressed me was the stat line. It'll come up in a second here as we're popping off, but it's probably one of the most ridiculous Tracer stat lines I have ever seen. and I may not see anything like it ever again in my lifetime, so I wanted to share it with you guys as we can maybe skip over here. So yeah, here we go. As you can see, Zest, almost 9k damage per 10, 22 elims, 11 final blows for 10 is also insane, but then 0.7 deaths per 10 on Tracer. When do you ever see something like that? Not even one death every 10 minutes? That's like a ludicrous, godlike Tracer stat line, and it came against Leave no less. And his play is kind of what sparked the Infernal's solid first week, and he deserves a lot of credit for stepping up and showing that he's hungry to improve instead of just being down in the dumps after a really disappointing tournament. It was awesome stuff. And with that, that basically concludes my mini all-star team of the week. Let me know what you think about it down in the comments below, and leave one of your own while you're at it. So now I wanted to conclude with just one final part of this podcast that I typically do, and that is looking towards the future. So first of all, if we look towards some of the matches next week, we've got some pretty interesting ones. Florida versus Boston is on the horizon. Houston play Atlanta Reign, I believe. Yep, it's there. Charge Infernal could be a pretty good one. Another chance for the Charge to bounce back. And also the Valiant play the London Spitfire. We genuinely could see the Valiant get their second win in the second consecutive week. London are very vulnerable right now, so who knows what's going to happen there. Like, this is shaping up to be a really big week, and it's all in preparation for the playoffs that are just a couple of months away. Speaking of the playoffs, as we look even further into the future, we finally got some details on this year's format and location as well. So first of all, playoffs are coming to Toronto, Canada. Not something I expected, but I think it makes sense. I mean, like, just given how good Toronto's location is and how good their homestand was before, I think that's really, really great, and it's super cool. But I do have some mixed feelings at the same time. On one hand, I understand it. I think the atmosphere is going to be absolutely electric. They already showed homestands can work there great, and you never know what could happen. Maybe Defiant could clutch their way in, and we could have a home team at the playoffs. But also, on the other hand, I kind of feel bad for the EU folks. They've been voicing their complaints about, seeing this announcement for a long time, which I understand. Like, Canada has 2 teams in OWL, so I think it can make sense to invest into their region. They're a part of it. But EU has literally had nothing, and they always seem to get the short end of the stick with, like, the timing of games and everything. They can never get anything nice. Overwatch League, for whatever reason, just does not care about them. And it's a serious slap in the face, They've never had any kind of LAN event in Europe since the league's inception. They've had, like, World Cup stuff, but never anything Overwatch League related. And because of that, I think EU fans have every right to be upset. I think it totally makes sense. EU is such a big part of Overwatch esports, and you guys have gotten literally nothing. So if you feel the need to complain, if you're upset, I think that frustration is totally justified, and I'm with you there. I think it's horrible that you guys literally get nothing, especially with how committed you guys are. You guys are arguably the most committed fans we have with how late you guys are constantly staying up. But this has kind of sparked a lot of conversation within the community. There's been a lot of arguments. There's been a bunch of back and forths on both sides. Is having an EU LAN even profitable? Does it make sense? Is it unfair? It's up to you to decide. I just wanted to bring this up because it has been a pretty big talking point since the announcement went down. And I definitely wanted to give EU fans a little bit of love and show you guys that, I'm with you there. I feel bad for y'all. It's awful. Either way, though, I'm still pretty hyped for the playoffs. I don't mind the idea of a Toronto finals at all. I think it'll be really fun, and maybe there's a chance I could even go. Maybe it's possible. We'll have to see what happens. Either way, we'll see what happens in a couple of months. So now, on the topic of, the actual playoffs, we did also get the format and what that's going to look like, and that's where the concerns really might come from. Not so much that we lack EU events, but, the format itself is what seems to be drawing a lot of eyes. So first off, playoffs are going to consist of 8 teams. You're going to have 5 from the West and 3 from the East, with the top 3 teams in the West and I believe the number 1 team in the East automatically qualifying. And the rest of the competition will have to compete in play-in knockouts to decide the order. In the West, it's like seeds 4 through 10, I think. Then the East, it's kind of just a bloodbath with knockouts. And that's all fine and well. That makes sense. That's great as usual. But I think it's the bracket itself that's kind of raising some eyebrows in this community. Instead of the traditional 8-team double elimination bracket, as you'd see in this scenario, in the playoffs, we're going to have these 8 teams be separated into 2 groups of 4. With what I believe to be, the number 1 seed in the West being on one bracket, and then the number 1 in the East in the other. So these groups are apparently going to be drafted, and once the 2 groups are decided, they're going to play in 2 separate double elimination brackets, with the 2 survivors of each advancing to the final day. And that means we're going to have 4 teams all competing on the day of the grand finals. It's going to be single elimination, 3 matches total, and that means stamina and the mental game could play a pretty big role in this. I don't think anybody gets an advantage, which I think is cool. Everybody has the same path. You've got to win 2 games in a row, otherwise you're going home empty-handed. There's going to be a lot of action in something that's a bit different from the norm. And what's the verdict on this, you may ask? Well, from what I've seen, a lot of people don't like it, which I think is understandable. I think it's a little weird personally. In a way, it could actually be a good thing though, which I think might seem kind of controversial to say in some people's eyes, but I think it may end up being a good thing. I'm not saying it will be. I'm not trying to defend anything. But instead of doing the same old, they're at least trying to reinvent the wheel. I don't know if the execution's going to come through, but I do appreciate their efforts to at least try and spice things up, A new format could keep people invested, and you never know what kind of good rivalries we could get and what kind of interesting outcomes could come with it. However, at the same time, going this ambitious could be taking it maybe a little too far. Like, having teams be separated from each other is maybe not the best idea, as there's no way to ensure that the most deserving teams are going to make it there. I don't really know how the brackets are going to be decided, if there's a specific order, or if it's going to be random, or if they're getting drafted by like top teams or something. But either way, we could be in a scenario where one bracket is noticeably more stacked than the other, which means there's a chance that someone who probably shouldn't be in the finals will get a chance to compete in the finals, which really sucks for the spirit of competition and interesting matches. I, for one, prefer to have endless possibilities that are set up by anyone being able to play anybody else. That's how we've gotten some pretty fun matches in the past, you feel me? Like, we're just limiting ourselves in what we could possibly end up seeing. We're limiting the possibilities and the scenarios that we could get. We could be in a scenario where we're just trying to have, as many teams as possible that are good going up against Atlanta to get them out early or something, just for them to fail, so that on the final day it's like Atlanta and 3 bums. I don't know, man. Like, I find this format interesting and exciting, and I want to see how it plays out, but I'm also so skeptical of the delivery. Either way, I think it's either going to be really, really good or a complete flop, and I don't see any sort of in-betweens whatsoever. Part of me wishes they'd go back to some of the old formats. I think reinventing the world more like the traditional sports route, like we saw in the Season 1 playoff format, was pretty good, but I do understand, you have a lot of teams, and it'd be hard to get through that in like a best-of-3 series, but I really liked that format a lot, and I wouldn't mind seeing that just in like a standard 8-team tournament like we'd see in like a, NBA playoff, etc. That would be pretty cool, but oh well. I guess we'll find out soon enough how this goes, though. Playoffs are just around the corner, and there's a lot to look forward to in these coming weeks. The summer stage could be a lot of fun, and, with some of the unexpected outcomes we've had, we could be in for a photo finish. Let me know what you think of this format down in the comments below, and if you're excited for the playoffs and the rest of the summer stage. And as I bid you farewell, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this first week of the summer down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, and you want to stay up to date with all the most recent episodes of the podcast, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you're new. And until the next one, guys, I'm out of here. Peace.